This isn't my own personal story, but it's a story my mom told me once when we were binge watching Unsolved Mysteries together. I wasn't born when this happened, and I was about 10 when she told me this story. It really still sticks with me. Way back in the 80s, my mom and her ex-husband met a guy at his salesman job. Her husband became pretty good friends with him. His name was Jose, and they were friends for quite a while before the incident occurred. Jose had, by this time, become very close with the whole family, so naturally my older brothers knew him and they were all very comfortable with being alone with him. He would go out with my mom and her husband on Fridays for pizza. He would tuck in my brothers into bed with my mom, just normal things your dad's friends would do as an uncle type figure. My mom said he was a very respectful and caring, gentlemanly type guy. She said he seemed like he wouldn't even hurt a fly, so naturally, she was completely wrong. Turns out, he was extremely jealous and heavily addicted to cocaine. He constantly fought with his girlfriend Mary, and she finally got fed up and decided to leave when she suspected him of being involved with drugs. He wasn't the least bit okay with that, being that he was one of the "if I can't have you, then nobody can" types. So he tells her that she can't leave, and she gets physical with him. Things escalate further and he murders her. First he beat her with the bat and then gives her something called an Italian necktie, and repeatedly stabs her in the neck. He left his apartment and waited a few hours before he decided to go off to his father's house and confess. My mom found out a few days later from his brother and was just completely floored. This gentle man who tucked my brothers into bed and was just all around nice, helpful, murdered his girlfriend in cold blood. What chills me to the bone is that he really was just crazy, hiding it so well even with the drug use. When he killed her, there was no alcohol or drugs in his system. He didn't even know he stabbed her in the beginning. During the trial, he was put under hypnosis to better understand what was going on in his head, because he didn't even know. Needless to say, after that my mom was always cautious of everyone. Growing up, she always told me, always remember, you never really know someone. Most people don't even know themselves. It's true. You really never know a person. I do believe he's no longer incarcerated. This happened to myself and a close friend just last month. We're both 23-year-old males. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking camping trip in the mountains of New York. We're both very comfortable with nature and spend a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, you know the works. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This is not a very heavily trafficked area, and we didn't expect to run into anybody. Our first night there, we were just sitting around the fire when we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake at around 10:30 p.m. This is fairly unusual, however, we didn't think much of it. But as time went on, the flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night, and we didn't particularly want an unwelcomed guest. Once it was clear that the person was heading towards our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who had wandered up. I took a small axe with me and my friend had his rifle. We weren't expecting trouble and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. Now, the moment of truth. The flashlight came near the light of our fire and it was just one man. He had a beard and was probably in his mid-40s. The scary part was he was carrying around what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling, "I know you're out there. Why don't you come out and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under the hemlock tree about 50 yards away. This is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods. He also swung his flashlight around several times after what felt like hours. He grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire and threw them in to burn. My friend, who had trained the rifle at the man, asked me if I should shoot him. I told him absolutely not. Unless he spots us and starts to point the gun in our direction. Thankfully, the man moved off from where he had come after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake, ran out, grabbed everything we could fit into my pack and took off. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. We ran out of the trail with flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported it, where we also spoke to some forest rangers. That was about it. I haven't heard anything back from the police, and it wasn't mysterious. However, it creeped the hell out of both of us. So this happened to my mom about 21 years ago when my brother and I were only kids. We used to live pretty far out of the town, like a 5-minute drive, which doesn't sound like much, but it was far enough to not get many visitors unless they were invited. She moved to this little house because she had just gotten divorced from my dad, and the guy that owned the house felt sorry for her and gave her a very good price for the rent. So she didn't mind, and it was a tiny house out in the middle of nowhere. So one night this guy calls out the house and knocks on the front door. My mom goes to answer it, and in our town, your mind doesn't instantly jump to the worst case scenario. This young guy in his mid-20s at the door was covered in blood, dirt, and completely out of breath. He asked my mom if he could use the phone. He hit an animal with his car and needed a taxi. My mom said no and that he had to go somewhere else. When she was closing the door, he stuck his foot in and said, "Can I use your phone?" I should point out that my uncle, who's a handyman, is 6'3" and he's fairly strong. Was out with my mom at the time fixing something in the kitchen, I think. He came out to the front door, saw the guy and told him to fuck off. Followed after the man and watched as he jumped into the nearby field and just started running into the pitch black. He decided to stay the night just in case the guy came back. The next morning, when my mom was about to take me and my little brother to school, the police showed up and wouldn't let her leave the house. Turns out some guy was arrested after brutally killing a young 11-year-old kid. Just shortly before calling at our house, I assume. This story still kind of freaks me out to this day, and I don't know what would have happened if my uncle hadn't been there that night. Before I start this story, I feel like my saviors warrant an introduction. I lived out in the countryside as a child, my house right next door to our grandmother's, surrounded by woods and a beautiful pond. We were also surrounded by a good bit of rednecks, not bad people we had known all our lives, just about, but weren't always the most clean or proper. And what came with that was dogs. People didn't fix their dogs, people dumped off unwanted dogs or puppies, and most of the people just let their dogs roam free rather than keep them fenced in. We'd always have dogs just wander into our lives one after another. They just show up and stick around. The dog that became the standard to which I hold every other dog was affectionately coined Mama, a German Shepherd mix, which we can only assume went through all sorts of hell before coming to us pregnant with pups. We gave away the pups, but kept her, and she soon after became our guardian. She was pretty gentle with humans, and cunning, strong, and she was very protective. She was a perfect storybook dog and always watched over us. Cream, although, was her opposite. A mix between a lab and chow and some other small dog breed, I imagine. He bit nearly everyone he came across, while Mama judged visitors with a careful, quiet eye. Cream did the same, but with a natural distrust. He was wild in his protectiveness, once running back and forth between my brother and I while I was in the backyard and he was at the pond, anxious that he couldn't be in two places at once. I was 14 and it was the middle of summer when the tree cutter came. I was alone when an old red pickup truck pulled over at my grandma's house. I didn't think much of it. People all over town knew my grandma and stopped by to get plums or various fruits from her garden or to ask to fish at the pond. I figured he'd realize she wasn't there and leave, but he didn't. And feeling safe in a community where everyone knew everyone and no one locked their doors, I decided to walk across and see what he wanted. Mama and Cream were nowhere to be found. They were on a hunting trip in the woods behind the house, I assumed. I walked into the carport and saw the man leaving my grandmother's house, which instantly set off a red flag. But he had already seen me. "Can I help you, sir? Are you looking for my grandmother?" I called, hand going to the cell phone in my pocket. He didn't seem too out of place, just a normal white guy with stubble and a receding hairline. But he was certainly nervous. I didn't see it at the time, but I'd later find my grandmother's jewelry box quickly thrown behind the wheelbarrow in the carport. I'm here to survey the trees. To cut. This was a baffling statement in and of itself. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was in the carport, not the woods. It just didn't make any sense at all. I replied by saying, "We don't need any trees cut. I think you're at the wrong house." I could feel a deep sense of unease and fear in my stomach now. He could have played it off cool at that point, got in his truck and drove away, but instead, he panicked. Thanks to the way the carport was laid out, he was close enough to easily push me against the wall and place a hand on my mouth. His eyes immediately became wild, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was up to something. He mumbled a bunch of things. My panicked mind almost zoned out. Was it going to go down like this? What should we do? What should we do? He began dragging me, kicking and fighting, sobbing into the carport and towards the woods merely a few feet away. It was about that time when I saw a black and yellow streak and heard some very angry barks and snarls. It was Cream that latched onto the man's leg, causing him to let go of me, and I quickly scrambled to Mama. Every fur on her back was raised, teeth bared in a snarl, legs stretched out as she stood between me and the man. "They'll bite. They'll kill you," I remember myself screeching, voice raw and full of fear and anger. He managed to detach himself from Cream and ran, but Cream chased him all the way to his car, barking and snarling, and then down the road a little ways before returning. I stayed there for a few moments, clinging to Mama, crying into her fur. She was still stiff, rigid, but she sniffed me, allowing me to cling onto her at the same time. I almost immediately pulled out my cell phone and called the police and my mom, and ran back to my house. I locked the door and tried to calm myself down. Cream had blood on his muzzle and chest, droplets most likely from the tree cutter. He managed to get away with quite a few valuables, including my grandmother's wedding ring from her deceased husband. He was caught about 8 months later, but the valuables were never returned, already pawned off. Still, I'm just glad to know he got jail time. Who knows what he was planning to do to me. At the end of May of the year 1999, I was headed into my freshman year of high school. That summer, me and a group of 6 girls from my church went on a mission trip up the coast of the Riverside, California, to Mount St. Helens, Washington. 3 of the girls' mothers acted as our drivers and chaperones. We basically all piled up into an old Chevy van and station wagon. I got baptized at a historic mission. We spent 3 days in San Francisco, saw the capital of Portland, Oregon, Yosemite. Basically, we got to see every noteworthy landmark and stay in every noteworthy town from SoCal to the Canadian border. When we stayed in Yosemite National Park, we spent 3 nights on the Cedar Lodge. While in Yosemite and sightseeing, the old Chevy van died out in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, even though we were unable to get cell signal, within an hour somebody stopped and helped us. This was so long ago, I don't remember all the details, but basically the owner of the van told us later that the mechanic told her that somebody tampered with our engine. She was very upset by this and said that it was something that was done intentionally. The van had to be abandoned, and we just used the rental the rest of the way. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but turns out that Carrie Anthony Stainer, aka the Yosemite Killer, was the maintenance man for the Cedar Lodge during this time. He had murdered and decapitated a park ranger by the time we were guests at the lodge the very next month. The very next month, he gained access to a room where a woman and her young daughter were staying under the guise of checking the room for something. Basically, he knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and because he worked at the lodge, they opened the door. He abducted, then raped, murdered, and decapitated them. I can't say that I remember seeing him, but we probably did, as we were there for 3 nights. It's just one of those things that I look back on and think he could have easily knocked on one of our doors, as it was just a few weeks before, and decided he wanted to abduct and kill us. I feel incredibly lucky that we dodged a bullet. If the time frame wasn't so close, it wouldn't creep me out as much, but it continues to haunt me 16 years later. Hey everyone, hopefully you got your daily dose of spooks, and if you enjoyed watching, then hit that like button as hard as you can. Also, if you have any recommended or personal stories you want to send me, go ahead and see my email in the description below. Feel free to send me anything you guys think is, worth reading. Well, I guess that's all I have to say about all this. I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye.